In this lecture, we're going to go through the 11 organ systems of the human body. And I'm not going to go into great depth on any one of them. We're going to just do a quick overview of the 11. And then as we get through the year, we're going to start to delve in deeper, obviously, into these organ systems. Now, one thing I do want to make sure everybody understands is all 11 organ systems are necessary for survival. And you might think one is more important than the other. And there are some that have very important jobs that, you can't live without. But in reality, every single one of them has an important job that you can't live without. All 11 organ systems are necessary for survival, and if one doesn't work, the entire system shuts down. So let's run through them now, and then we'll move on to the next topic. So the first one is the integumentary system, which is one that often gets overlooked as an organ, but that's that one trivia question. If you ever get asked it, I'm not a huge fan of it, but it is true. Yes, the integumentary system, yes, the skin is the largest organ in the human body because it is one continuous organ that covers your entire outer body. Now, what is it made up of? Well, your skin, and we're going to talk more about that later in the year, but your skin actually has two layers. There's the epidermis, which is the outer layer, which is actually mostly dead, and we'll talk more about that. And then below it, you have what's called the dermis, and that is the tough, thick layer, which is going to, actually, that's what produces the layers above it. So we'll talk more about that layer. But also, it includes your nails, your sweat glands, and your hair. So all of those things are extremely important for survival. So what are the jobs of your integumentary system? Also, you can say it integumentary. Either one works. First is the most obvious one is to protect your underlying tissue. So your skin is your protection to the world outside, mainly from bacteria. We are covered head to toe in bacteria, and all it takes is a little break in that skin, a little cut in that layer for your body to become infected. That's why it's so important when you get cut that you clean it right away so it doesn't get infected. Another important job of your integumentary system is to keep your body temperature. We just did a whole thing about homeostasis of body temperature, and that is where we have our sweat glands. And our sweat glands is what allows us to bring our body temperature down to where we need to be, but also our hair keeps us warm. Now, humans don't have a whole lot of hair on our bodies. Some obviously less than others, but that hair does have an important job of keeping us warm. One thing I always notice, and I'm surprised by every time I do it, is I grow a beard out a lot of times, and then when I shave it, it's amazing how much colder my face is. And then finally, that is our body's ability to communicate with the outside world in terms of touch. You may have heard the term somatic before, somatosensory. That is touch sense. So we have sensory receptors in our skin, which allow us to touch things and register if there's pain, if there's heat, or just simple touch, pressure. So there's actually three types of receptors in your skin in terms of touch. There's nociceptors, which pick up pain. There's thermoreceptors, which pick up temperature, and then there's pressure receptors, which pick up just how much force is being applied on your skin. The second system is going to be your skeletal system, and that is made up of your bones, your ligaments, and your cartilage. Now, what is the job of your skeletal system? Well, your skeletal system has a lot of jobs. The first one is it provides a framework for your body. It's what dictates the size of your body. Your shoulder length, width, I should say, your height, the length of your arms, those are all dictated by your skeleton. It also is what all the muscles attach to and all the ligaments attach to. And it has a couple other important jobs. For one thing, it also is protective. Your rib cage protects your lungs and your heart. Your cranium protects your brain. Your pelvic bones protect your reproductive organs and the bottom of your digestive tract. The only area we don't actually have skeleton protecting our organs is our abdominal cavity. And that is why we have our very wide, thin abdominal muscles, and they act as the protection for your abdominal organs. Also, very important, producing blood cells. You may have heard that before. Bone marrow is where we make our blood cells. So that is where red blood cells are made, that is where white blood cells are made, and that is where platelets are made. That is also what your immune system is composed of. So bone marrow is extremely important. The next one is the respiratory system. The respiratory system is responsible for gas exchange. We rely on oxygen in order to have our cells function, and we rely on getting rid of carbon dioxide to get rid of waste. And that is all done by our respiratory system. It is composed of several components. The lungs, the pharynx, the larynx, and the trachea make up the respiratory system. What is the job of that? And also, obviously, in the lungs, you have bronchioles, and I'll talk about that for a moment. But the job of your respiratory system is exchange of gas between the air and blood. So I'm just going to bring up a diagram here real quick and try to show you what is going on there. Okay, let's see if I can make this work here. So you have your person here, right? My art's not the best, but we'll make this work, right? Okay, so basically what we have here is we have our cavity, our nasal cavity, and our mouth cavity meet up, and they travel down to your lungs, right? And that is where you breathe from. So there's a couple things I mentioned. I just want to bring up what they are. So your pharynx is this upper portion of your respiratory system. And what it does is it channels air down the right tube. So essentially, you have your nasopharynx, which brings air from your nose and your nostrils. You have your pharynx coming from your mouth, and then they come together, and that is what brings air down to your lungs. There's also something called the larynx, which sits right here. And what your larynx is, it's a specialized little box with a muscle in there, and that's your voice box. So your larynx is what causes air to pass through, and the muscles in there open and close real fast. They kind of go like this. And depending on the frequency with which they open and close and the strength at which they open and close, that is what causes sound and makes different, voice, you're loud or quiet or different tones there. So the respiratory system is going to be your lungs, your pharynx, your larynx, your trachea, and then it's also going to be your bronchioles, that's what's in your actual lungs that cause the oxygen exchange. And we'll talk more about that later. Okay, could just do a couple more in this lecture. The reproductive system is going to be the male and female reproductive organs, and the job of that is obviously to produce a new organism. So I'm not going to go into detail on that because you've all taken health class, but as you know, we have the testes in the male, we have the ovaries in the female for production of gametes, and then we have the sex organs. And then the last one on this slide is the endocrine system. Now, this is a system that I don't go into too much detail on in this class other than giving lots of examples, but hopefully I'll get to enough of it to give you a good background. But the endocrine system, anything that has the word gland after it, is going to be your endocrine system. And its job is it secretes hormones, and those hormones travel around through the circulatory system, and they trigger responses. For example, we have the pituitary gland, which is at the base of our brain, right in the middle of our brain, I should say, hanging off of the hypothalamus, and that triggers growth, right? That's what triggers your production of, when you go through puberty, production of hair and all those things. The thyroid gland is responsible for maturing blood cells and things like that. And then we have adrenal glands, which you've probably heard of adrenaline before. Those are all glands which release hormones. Other organs that are going to be part of that, your pancreas we mentioned. There's also going to be the testes and the ovaries. So there's a lot of organs that make up the endocrine system. I'm going to do a couple more. The muscular system is responsible for providing force that cause movement, right? So your muscles are essentially rubber bands, and we have hundreds of muscles that make up the human body. I think there's 600 something muscles. We probably know of the major ones, right? The superficial muscles, which make large movements, like your biceps, right? Everybody knows the bicep. If I tell any little kid, hey, show me a muscle, they're going to show you the bicep muscle. And basically what the muscle does, they're very simple. Imagine a rubber band that's attached between two different bones. And when that rubber band gets smaller, it pulls one bone towards the other bone, and that's what causes movement. So without muscles, there's no movement. And that's really their only job. But movement's extremely important. When people lose the ability to move, their entire system starts to shut down. So for example, if you know any elderly people that have been injured and they can't move around as much, usually their health starts to plummet rather quickly because they don't have the ability to move, get their circulation going. Movement is such an important part of health. The nervous system is a really important system. That is going to be your brain, your spinal cord, and your nerves. And what's the job of your nervous system? Well, that's the communication. It's the wiring of the body. It's an electrical system which sends impulses from one end of a neuron to the other. Your brain is made up of trillions of connections of neurons, and those neurons are what trigger responses throughout your body. A neuron is always going to connect to one of three things. It's either going to connect to a muscle, to a gland or to another neuron. So for example, in your brain, it's made up of a whole lot of neurons that are all connected to each other, and they trigger thoughts and they make, and movement. And then the muscle ones are going to be your motor neurons, and that's what triggers a muscle to move. And then finally, your glands are also going to be triggered by neurons. So for example, if you heard a gunshot, that's going to trigger your heart to start increasing. You're going to start to sweat. Your muscles are going to get more blood flow. That is all done by your adrenal glands. So you may have, again, adrenaline, that's epinephrine. That's what triggers that response. The cardiovascular system is made up of your heart and your arteries, your capillaries, and your blood. So the blood is made in the skeletal system, the blood cells, but the blood itself lives in the cardiovascular system. And that is made up of, like I said, your heart, which is a muscle that pumps blood through your arteries, which carry oxygenated blood to the body. And then you have your veins, which should be on here. Your veins are carrying deoxygenated blood back to the heart, so that way it can go to the lungs and get oxygenated. And then the capillaries are where that exchange occurs. That's a good stopping point for this, and I'll have another one for the second part.